Your Majesty, there are two men outside, strangers, who seem like sons of Zeus. Please tell me, should we take off the harness from their horses, or send them off to find another lord?
Flushed, Menelaus shouted angrily, "You used to have some brains. Now you're talking like a silly child. Untap their horses, lead them in to dine."
All right then, I'll just go and get that done, Mary. Please. You're very regal, very regal. This is some lines, not exactly from the very beginning, from almost the beginning of the Odyssey Book 4, which is where we are, dear listeners, in Odyssey Book Club. I have just, this morning, flown from Milwaukee to Washington, D.C., so I'm a little, I don't know, discombobulated. Actually, at Milwaukee Airport, when you go through security, there's an area called recombobulation area, which I feel I should have paused that to recombobulate myself. I just absolutely love it.
I'm not going to share my travel experiences of today, but I think there's nothing like the Odyssey and A Tale of Homecoming to kind of concentrate the mind. And it's great because we've got to really one of my favourite books here, book 4 of the Odyssey, and it is so full of surprises. We last saw Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, leaving Pylos, where he'd been to interrogate the old king Nestor about what had happened to his dad, what had happened to Odysseus. And he then moves on to find out what news the king of Sparta, Menelaus, might have. And he's come to Sparta with Nestor's son, Pisistratus. And the bit we just read you at the beginning is the arrival of these two young men, Telemachus and Pisistratus, who have come to quiz Menelaus about what he knows, arriving at Menelaus's palace. Now, I think that our expectations may be quite interestingly aroused here because, as you remember, Menelaus is the husband of Helen, so-called Helen of Troy. And it was Helen being stolen by or going off with the Trojan prince Paris and going off to the city of Troy that caused the Greeks to launch the Trojan War to get her back. 10 years of war and then more years following, and here we are at the now reunited marital home of Helen and Menelaus. You know, she's back with husband number one. One of the things that always just gets me going about this book is that you're expecting the atmosphere to be a little bit frosty, perhaps, that the adulteress has been forcibly brought back home to her rather blustering, gruff husbands. But actually, it turns out to be quite different from that. We've got a great scene of we couldn't call it marital bliss, but Menelaus and Helen are getting on terribly well, and it all starts here from yet another hospitality scene. Menelaus says to the servant, "Don't be so damn stupid. Do you really expect us to send away people who've come for hospitality? Bring them in, get their horses fixed, and let's have dinner."
I think it's important also just to remind ourselves that Menelaus's brother Agamemnon was the leader of the Greek army who waged war on Troy for 10 years to get Helen back. So that's how it kind of fits in. We're going to hear about Agamemnon's going to come up in this book yet again, as he has come up in the previous couple of episodes. Agamemnon just keeps on rearing his head as a reference, as a character. But Menelaus is Menelaus comes across as sort of bluff and blustery, I think, and that's very clear in those lines that you read, Mary.
Yeah,
He's
you used to have some brains, he says to the
yeah,
guy.
yeah.
Now you're talking like a silly child.
So Telemachus has just come from Nestor's palace, which was full of very kind of genteel and generous hospitality. And now he's come into, that is sort of to the power 10. There's a wedding going on. There's a complicated, or rather, Menelaus's family members of Menelaus are getting married. So they've stumbled into a kind of enormous wedding feast.
What's interesting is because he doesn't know, Menelaus doesn't know who these boys are. So Telemachus and Pisistratus, they've been searching out Menelaus, and they've come to Menelaus's palace. But the people inside the palace, Menelaus in particular, is welcoming these guests as you should, without actually knowing what their identity is.
Don't ask questions as soon as your guests arrive. Instead, he gives a little reminiscence about his own adventures and says that he's been, it took him a long time to get home after the Trojan War. He traipsed through Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Sidon and Araby and Libya. And he also has a little reminisce about, as if by chance, Odysseus, Telemachus' father, he does say, I get so upset thinking about Odysseus, my dearest companion. And, it must be awful. It must be awful for his boy, Telemachus. Menelaus doesn't realize that he's actually talking to Telemachus himself. And of course, as it would, this causes Telemachus to burst into tears. I mean, this book of the Odyssey, which is one of my favorite books of the Odyssey, is full of people crying. It's full of emotion. And I think, as we've said before, in the Odyssey and in Homer generally, people don't have sophisticated emotions that they keep inside. The emotions are on the outside. So if you feel angry, you are angry. If you're sad, you cry. It's not in any way a sort of sense that you must be weak or feeble or kind of emotionally incontinent if you cry. That's part of having an emotion. But he cries, and it's at that sort of awkward moment of Telemachus being in tears that everything changes, because the doors open and Helen comes in like a Hollywood goddess, deliciously draped in beautiful clothing, surrounded by enslaved women who are actually named, oddly and sort of wonderfully. She comes out of her fragrant bedroom like Artemis, like the goddess Artemis, and bringing these sort of lovely kind of accessories with her. My favourite of which is a silver basket on wheels, which is part of her kind of weaving and spinning equipment. So we've already talked about how spinning and weaving comes up a lot, and even Helen of Troy is involved in this activity. But she sits down, Mary, and she instantly knows what she's saying, isn't she? She recognizes Telemachus.
That's right. I mean, we've got to remember that Helen is the daughter of a god. So she's half divine. And to some extent in this book, we get that sense that half divinity does give her kind of quite special powers of recognition and disguise. And in this case, there she comes. And straight away, she kind of thinks, this is Telemachus. Now, I find this bit a bit odd because she's going back to when Telemachus was a tiny baby, just as Odysseus left. And she says, he's the spitting image of the baby. Well,
good luck.
All
babies
luck.
look the same.
All babies look the same. But the point here is that I think Helen's got it. Helen can see, whereas other people have been either confused or politely not asking. Helen says, I know who they are. She knows who Telemachus is. The son of Nestor is a bit of a bit player here, but she knows who Telemachus is.
Yeah. And it's so important because the poem is so powerfully about recognizing people. And when that will all flower enormously when Odysseus gets back home eventually. But it's so powerfully also about Telemachus recognizing who he is metaphorically, Telemachus understanding that he is the true son of his father, actually and metaphorically, and the fact that Helen just sees it instantly is a really powerful
Yeah.
moment, I think. This is part of Telemachus coming into his true self.
Yeah. In this bit, the whole kind of Helen episode, we are taken back to wondering about the Helen who was the cause of the Trojan War. There she is now, kind of a few years on, and everything seems fine.
Yeah,
But
the hostess with the mostess, but
but
she's caused an enormous war.
and so actually throughout this book, we start to see different ways in which we can think of Helen, and that I think for readers now and for translators, it's quite hard to know exactly how far Helen's earlier conduct is being criticized. And there's a line here, and it's in Emily Wilson's translation. It's she saying, "I know Telemachus of old when he was a little newborn baby, and that was the day the Greeks marched off to Troy, their minds fixated on war and violence." And then she says, "They made my face the cause that hounded them." Now, that's been one of the most discussed lines in Wilson's translation, because what the Greek literally says, it says they went off to Troy because of me uh, and my dog face. There's a big set of issues about what dog face means, and most translators have Helen sort of saying, "Because I was a whore." They make
Yeah,
dog-faced
bitch that I
bitch. Yeah.
bitch that I am. I think from memory, Robert Fagles has. By the way, if you're interested in this moment of translator's dilemma, Emily Wilson has spoken and written about this quite a lot. So I will dig out some reference, and we can put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But it's a really
Yeah,
interesting one.
And Mendelssohn, the reason Mendelssohn says they went because of me, a shameless bitch.
How do you deal with dog-faced? It's just one of those. We have no real clue. Emily writes about this, but we have no real clue of what that is meant to kind of convey, actually.
And she has a very clever, even if not convincing, answer to that when she says, "They made my face," the face that launched out from the ships, all the rest. "They made my face the cause that hounded them." So she takes the doggy bit from the original Greek, because of me with my dog face. And she turns that into the English idiom of, "It was my face that made the cause that hounded them." We don't often stop in that great detail on these translations, but I think here it is really important, because one of the questions you come away with, as you read this book, is what are we being told about Helen, and how do we judge Helen? And there she is. She's a huge surprise. We didn't expect a kind of nice scene of domesticity. But what is, and how are they dealing with the backstory? And how you translate that line, whether you kind of turn her into a shameless bitch or whatever, starts to form the way you're thinking about Helen as a character. What happens after this? Helen's come down, or come into the room, recognized Telemachus. But then there's a whole load more kind of disaster narratives, and more crying, because Pisistratus, the son of Nestor, remembers his brother who's died.
I get the sense that everybody is crying about everyone's crying about their own stuff. Everyone starts to get upset about the past in different ways.
Helen starts crying. Menelaus is crying. Helen was weeping, as was Menelaus. Pisistratus' eyes were full of tears for the irreplaceable Antilochus.
Who I love in the Iliad. He's a lovely... Antilochus is the one who brings the news of Patroclus' death to Achilles, and he has this kind of tiny but very perfectly formed role, and part of it is being fast at running, he's fast at running here. Anyway, he's dead, and Pisistratus is terribly upset.
They don't quite know what to do, because Pisistratus then says, he addresses Menelaus and said, listen now to me. I disapprove of crying during dinner, right? We'll wait till the morning to cry. But they don't get out of this return to the appalling sadness of what's going on, I think
I find it touching and moving, and I completely sort of actually humanly recognizable those moments where somebody gets sad about something and somehow that reminds you of your own grief or whatever. It's to me it's a sort of very human passage, but it's brought to a close by this extraordinary and to me and almost sinister moment, which is that Helen takes it upon herself to drug everybody. She mixes some potion and puts it into the wine, and because she has all these, she's kind of special. She's learnt these skills in Egypt where she's been hanging out with Menelaus. But it says of these drugs, whoever drinks this mixture from the bowl will shed no tears that day, not even if her mother or her father die, not even if soldiers kill her brother or her darling son with bronze spears before her very eyes. By the way, it's Emily who puts her, I think. Emily Wilson makes that a feminine pronoun, interestingly. But the wider point is, do you want to take a drug, Mary, that would make you not care even if your mother, father, brother, or partner were killed?
No, it's kind of one of the ambivalences, repeated ambivalences in this book. You partly think, thank heavens, they've got to stop crying because we've got to get on with the plot. And Helen's there, and she's giving them a drug, and everybody's going to stop crying, and we're going to listen to some really interesting stories that are coming up. But there is always this sense that, how good is this drug? Do we want our heroes to go on crying? Do we want them to say life is awful and war is awful and I am sad because I have lost my family and my friends? Or do we want them to kind of, smoke on something which makes them just forget everything? And Helen gives them that. It makes you wonder a bit about Helen.
Yeah, she always seems to have an agenda, and we're never quite sure what that is. I mean, she's certainly working to her own set of rules. She's the daughter of Zeus. Her mother is mortal. Her father is the king of the gods, and that puts Helen in this different category from anyone else in the room, and makes her so intriguing and so ambiguous.
She's a fantastic storyteller,
and she knows what stories to tell.
Yes, and she knows that Telemachus wants to hear about Dad, so she tells a really extraordinary story of something that happened at Troy during the war, which featured Odysseus. And it is very strange. I mean, Odysseus, what he does, according to Helen, or she remembers this moment, that he disguised himself as a beggar. And he came in from the Greek camp. He came into the city of Troy, and nobody recognized him except, of course, for Helen. Because Helen,
she recognizes everybody.
Everybody. And she saw him. She says he was too smart to talk. He acted evasive. But what did she do? I washed and scrubbed him with oil and dressed him, and I swore an oath that I would not reveal him to the Trojans before he'd got back to his own camp. And he told me all the things the Greeks were planning. Right? Now, at this point, you think, is Helen a double agent?
Yes, I mean, this is all very John le Carré. I mean, this is sort of spy story stuff, isn't it? He's gone in undercover. Bookmark that, my friends, because Odysseus is going to disguise himself as a beggar later on in this poem. So, this is a big sort of flag. This is the kind of man. He's cunning. He's capable of subterfuge. It's that polytropos thing that we talked about in the first episode of the book club. And, what is he up to? So he's come to find out the plans of the Trojans. But what's Helen's position in this? Is she then going to give it all away to the Trojans, or is she going to keep it to herself?
Well, we know that she's, by this time, however, it must be late in the war, she says, I wanted to go home, right? So she recognizes Odysseus, she looks after Odysseus. She probably keeps his counsel, we don't know, but she says, I wish that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, had not made me go crazy when she took me from my country and made me leave my daughter and the bed I shared, she says, looking at Menelaus, with my fine, handsome, clever husband. So we see the regretful Helen, or we see the clever Helen in front of the husband, now saying, darling, I wish I'd never done it.
Yeah, fascinating. Like, who's her audience? She's got multiple audiences. She's got Telemachus. She's got Menelaus, her husband. She needs to spin a line to him. And, she's also got us, because she happens to be telling us a great story flashback to the Trojan War. Plus, you're saying she misses her daughter. Well, her daughter's not explicitly in this scene, but it is her daughter's wedding that we're at. So, she's maybe throwing a line. This is very kind of under in the weeds, but they're sort of throwing a line to everybody, really.
No, I think it's great, because I think that it's easy to see how later authors have somehow complexified Helen. What were Helen's motives, etc., etc. What I think is really interesting is that the complexity of Helen is there absolutely already in the Odyssey. This book shows you all the different conflicting ways that you could think about Helen, and it gets even weirder because that this is a nice this is marital storytelling, and Helen has told her story about Odysseus being disguised as a beggar infiltrating Troy. Then Menelaus chips in with another story which features Odysseus, but also features himself and Helen. And it's an amazing story because it takes us inside the Trojan horse.
Yeah. It's so brilliant.
I mean, famously, or, perhaps not famously enough, the Trojan horse has no part in the Iliad. The Iliad is about a bit of the Trojan War, but it happens before the Trojan horse, which is brought into Troy with the Greeks sitting inside, and it's a trick which is going to finally defeat the Trojans, because out of this horse, the Greek warriors, or the crack Greek warriors, will emerge. But what is amazing about this is Menelaus was one of those guys with Odysseus inside the Trojan horse, and he gives us a little kind of picture of what the people inside the horse are hearing going on the outside. And here's Helen again, damn her. Helen is walking around the horse, and she is impersonating the voices, presumably calling upon she's impersonating the voices of the wives of the men inside the horse.
And again, it's so wonderfully kind of obscure. I mean, is this part of what she discussed with Odysseus so that he knows it's coming? The reason why this is an important story for Telemachus to hear is, again, because it's about Odysseus's cleverness, because only he, realizes what's going on. He clamps his hand over the mouths of those of his fellow soldiers who want to cry out idiotically, because what would their wives be doing in the streets of Troy? He makes sure that no one responds to this, and that and that, they're not found out. But it feels like who is Helen? Is Helen sort of on the side of the Trojans or the Greeks in this moment? I mean, it's very hard to tell.
And it's impossible, and it's made more complicated for me by the fact that it says that Helen is going round the horse calling on the men, or pretending to be the wives of the men inside. She must already know it's a trick. She obviously knows that there are Greek soldiers inside. And it mentions, and you wouldn't notice this unless you were really alerted to it. Menelaus, when he's describing this, says, addressing Helen, godlike Deiphobus was following you. And you think, godlike Deiphobus? Who's this? Well, actually, Deiphobus is the very little known partner of Helen, Trojan, to whom Helen was briefly married after the death of Paris in the Trojan War, and before Menelaus killed Deiphobus and got Helen back. So we got this image of Helen going round talking to the Greeks inside, and Deiphobus, her short-term husband, is following her around the Trojan horse. Now, when we tell the story of the Trojan horse, we do not tell that story.
Yeah, we had an episode in the main feed about Cassandra. And in a way, Cassandra's story around the Trojan horse is maybe even better known. Cassandra warns the Trojans against bringing this wretched thing in. I think that's fairly well known comparatively. This is a little obscure corner, but a fascinating one. What did the Trojans think she was doing by calling by calling out Odysseus, Odysseus in Penelope's voice? None of it makes any sense, to be fair, but it's sort of brilliant.
It's a wonderful image, and it's a kind of wonderful. I think it's a wonderful way of seeing how there are these intriguing, puzzling, never quite sense-making bits in the Odyssey, where you think, so what difference does that make to my view of the Trojan horse or Helen, etc.? So I think it's just wonderful. Of course, in this case, Telemachus feels a bit sad at this because
the drugs didn't work, Helen.
Telemachus
is still sad.
And he says, I think we better get to bed now. So this is, they've arrived from Pylos, they've arrived at Sparta, they've had this great bit of hospitality, they've heard all these stories, they've cried, shed loads of tears. And Telemachus says, I think we ought to go to bed. And the hospitality goes on being absolutely fantastic. There's blankets and coverings, woolly covers, and girls go out and they make up their beds. Telemachus and Pisistratus, Nestor's son, the guests, slept in the front room. But just in case you're worrying about the relationship between Menelaus and Helen, Menelaus slept far back inside the lofty house. Beside him lay marvellous Helen in her flowing gown. So we end.
How lovely!
We end
They're
day
both
one of
together in bed.
Day one of this book ends up. There's more of the book to follow because it takes up for the next day. But day one of this book ends with Menelaus and Helen in their marital bed together.
Well, Mary, let's leave them there, snoozing, arm in arm, or, nestled up together. And let's return in our next episode to the rest of Odyssey Book 4, that is, strictly speaking, lines 304 or 305 onwards to the end of the book. And, good night, Helen. Good night, Menelaus.
Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams.
Sweet dreams. And we'll see you next time.
If you've got any thoughts, if you've got any ideas, anything you'd like us to do, contact us on instantclassicspod, all one word, @gmail.com.
Or on our social media at instantclassicspod.
Instant Classics Book Club will be back soon. And in the meantime, head to the main feed for more from Instant Classics.
See you next time.